She was 23, and she had just lost the last thing that was holding her life together. Not all at once. First the job, gone in a quiet decision that erased months of her work in just a few minutes. Then the room, a place that was never really home, but it was the only place she had. By the end of the month, everything she owned fit into a single bag and a few dollars. And with one of those dollars, she bought a building no one had entered in years. A place everyone had already given up on. The granite foundation had heaved at the northeast corner. The cedar shingle roof had failed in 2 sections. The iron door had been padlocked from the outside, and the padlock had rusted through sometime in the early 1980s, and no one had forced it since. The Maine Historic Preservation Commission had deaccessioned the building in 2009, but what no one knew was that something inside that place had been hidden, waiting just for her. She kept that printed email folded carefully in the back of her notebook and returned to it more than once, not out of pride, but as a reminder that her work had been seen and understood by someone who knew what to look for. It became a quiet point of reference, something that grounded her during the long hours in the field when progress felt slow and recognition seemed distant. But the stability that had begun to form did not last. One cold afternoon, while she was out in the estuary working, through another set of measurements, her supervisor left an envelope on her desk. It was placed there without urgency, without explanation. Just a standard institute letterhead folded neatly, waiting for her return. When she came back, she found it where it had been left untouched. She stood there for a moment before opening it, as if something in her already understood what it might contain. The letter was brief, direct, and carefully worded. The first paragraph explained a reduction in funding. The second expressed regret. There was no discussion, no alternative, no extension. Only an ending presented in the same controlled tone that had carried her forward until that moment. She stood there in the quiet of the lab, holding the letter in her hands, and read it once and then again, as if the meaning might shift if she gave it enough time to settle. The words remained the same, clear and final, leaving no space for interpretation or resistance. After reading it, she turned the page over and held it up toward the window, letting the light pass through the paper so she could see the watermark of the Institute printed faintly within it, as if confirming that it was real, that it belonged to the same place where she had spent the past months, building something she believed would continue. Then she placed it back on the desk and sat down. Slowly, her movement controlled without urgency. Her eyes drifting toward the window, where the bay stretched out beyond the glass. The water was gray. That afternoon, the tide moving steadily outward, carrying with it the quiet rhythm she had known for years. She watched it for a long time, not searching for an answer, but allowing herself to see it clearly, the way she had been taught. And in that stillness, she understood something simple and certain, that this moment was real and that it was time to move. After that afternoon, everything began to shift quickly. The fellowship ended, the income stopped, and the structure that had been holding her in place disappeared with a quiet finality that left no room for adjustment. The rent came due as it always did, but this time there was no certainty behind it, no assurance that it could be covered without consequence. She gathered what she could and left without delay. There was no extended planning, no attempt to hold on to something that had already begun to slip away. She packed her belongings into her car, a 2004 Subaru Forester, with a cracked windshield that had carried her through the long drives between stations, and turned north onto Route 1 in the early days of November. The road stretched ahead of her, lined with trees that had already lost most of their leaves. The air colder now, the light shorter, the season shifting toward something quieter, more uncertain. She drove without distraction, her focus steady not on where she was going, but on the simple act of continuing forward, because there was no other direction left to take, and somewhere along that road, without expectation, and without searching, she came across something that would change everything. It was a small green state surplus sign placed near the side of the road. Easy to miss if she had not been paying attention, the kind of sign most drivers would pass without. Noticing but something about it made her slow down. And look again, the words were simple, direct and almost out of place in their simplicity. For sale, historic coastal survey station. Penobscot Head, Castine, Maine. $1. She pulled the car over, without thinking, as if the decision had already been made before she understood it fully. The engine idling quietly while she sat there looking at the sign, reading it again and again, letting the meaning settle into something real. A building, place, something fixed being offered for the smallest possible price, as if its value had already been dismissed by everyone else. There was no immediate logic behind what she did next, no calculation, no plan. She reached for her phone and began looking up the listing, confirming that it was real, that it existed, that it had been there waiting without attention for longer than she had known. And in that moment, with almost nothing left, she chose to move toward it. She already knew the building, though, not in a way that came from careful attention, but in the quiet, familiar way. Something becomes part of your memory. Simply because it has always been there. The survey station stood on a headland above the bay, a small granite structure that had existed at the edge of her awareness since childhood. It was not something she had ever studied closely, but it had remained present enough that its absence would have felt noticeable. It had been part of the route her mother drove every Saturday morning, a fixed point along the circuit where the truck would stop and Ruth would step out and walk toward the water, while Nadia sat in the passenger seat watching the routine unfold the same way each time. Without change, without explanation, she had never gone inside the building. The door had always been locked. The assumption had been simple, that it held equipment or storage or something that belonged to the work her mother was doing. It had never required more thought than that. It was simply there, as constant and unexamined as the rest of the landscape. But now, standing at the edge of a decision with nothing left to hold on to, that same building took on a different meaning. Not as something familiar, but as something waiting, and for the first time she chose to move closer to it. She completed the purchase on a quiet Thursday in November, transferring $1 to the Maine Bureau of General Services. The amount set not because the building held no value, but because restoring it would require more than most people were willing to give it, had no utilities, no running water, no direct road access, since the gravel track leading to it had been gated years earlier, and for 3 years no one had made an offer. That was enough for everyone else to walk away. But for her it was enough to move forward. She borrowed a bolt cutter from a man named Gary, who ran the marine supply store in Castine, a man who had known her mother and who did not ask questions when she told him what she needed. He handed it to her without hesitation and said only that she should bring it back when she was done, as if that was all that needed to be said. She drove as far as she could along the gravel track until she reached the locked gate and left the car behind the rest of the way. She walked carrying the bolt cutter over her shoulder and the field bag across her back, moving through the overgrown path where alder had begun to reclaim the road step by step until the trees opened and the headland came into view. And there it was, exactly as it had always been, and yet completely different now that she had chosen to see it. The air coming off the bay was sharp and cold, carrying that clean edge that only appears in late autumn. When the temperature drops and the wind moves freely across open water, she stepped out onto the headland and stopped for a moment, letting herself take in the full view, the same view she had seen countless times as a child, but now without distance, without the barrier of the truck window or the assumption that she would simply leave again. The building stood near the edge, smaller than her memory had made it, and at the same time more solid, more defined, its granite walls darkened by years of exposure to salt air and weather, the surface marked with patches of lichen that had grown slowly over decades, blending into the stone, until they felt like part of it, rather than something separate. The roof held its shape, though sections had shifted, revealing the layers beneath, and the structure itself carried a quiet weight, the kind that comes from standing in the same place without interruption for longer than most people remember. She moved closer, step by step, her attention drawn, not by curiosity alone, but by something deeper, something that felt like recognition, as if she was not discovering it for the first time, but returning to something she had always known was there. And when she finally stood in front of the door, she paused, because this time she was not passing by. She was about to step inside. The iron door faced south just as it always had, its surface worn and darkened by decades of exposure. The padlock that held it shut had long since lost its original form, reduced to a rough, solid mass of rust, where the keyhole had disappeared completely into corrosion. It was clear that no one had opened it in years, perhaps decades, and whatever had once been stored behind it had been left undisturbed for longer than anyone nearby had thought about it. She adjusted her grip on the bolt cutter and stepped forward, positioning it carefully against the weakened metal. The sound of the cut was short and final, breaking through the silence of the headland with a dull snap that echoed briefly against the stone. The lock fell away. For a moment, she did not move. She stood there holding the door as if waiting for something to happen, as if crossing this threshold required more than just the physical act of opening it. Then, slowly she pushed. The hinges resisted, at first stiff from years of disuse, moving in small, reluctant increments before giving way just enough for the door to open inward. And with that single motion, the space inside revealed itself, quiet, untouched, and waiting. The air inside was cold and still carrying a dry scent that did not belong entirely to stone or salt. Something older, something that had remained sealed within the space for years, undisturbed by movement or time. She stepped across the threshold, slowly allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim light that entered through the small window on the far wall. The floor was packed, earth firm underfoot, and the walls were made of granite blocks fitted together with care. The lower sections laid dry, and the upper sections set with mortar that had hardened over decades into something almost indistinguishable from the stone itself. The fireplace was built into the north wall, its interior darkened with the marks of past use, the grate long gone, leaving only the shape of what had once been there. There was almost nothing else, no furniture, no equipment, no clear indication of what the space had held. Before it was left behind, the emptiness was complete, not neglected but final. As if everything that had once mattered inside this room had been removed with intention. She remained near the doorway for a long moment, taking it in, not searching, not moving forward, yet simply allowing the space to exist as it was. Because something about it did not feel empty, it felt unfinished. She stepped further inside slowly, her movements careful, not out of fear but out of awareness, as if the space required a certain kind of attention, the way her mother had once stood at the edge of the water before, taking a reading. She did not begin by searching for anything specific. She did not move directly toward the walls or the floor or the fireplace. Instead, she allowed herself to stand still in the center of the room, letting her senses adjust to what was there and what was not. The silence inside was complete, not heavy but steady, the kind of silence that does not demand to be filled. The light from the small window stretched across the floor in a narrow band, illuminating dust particles suspended in the air, moving slowly in currents too subtle to feel. She turned her head slightly, taking in the details, the texture of the stone, the way the mortar lines ran between the blocks, the small imperfections that marked where one piece met another. None of it appeared unusual at first glance. Nothing suggested that the space held anything beyond what could be seen. But she had learned not to rely on first impressions. She had learned to look longer. She moved toward the wall, slowly raising her hands and placing her palms flat against the stone. Not as a deliberate search, but as a natural extension of what she had been taught to do, to understand something. You begin with the thing itself, not with what you expect to find, but with what is actually there. The surface was cold, solid, and consistent, the kind of firmness that comes from years of settling into place. She moved her hands along the stone, feeling the joints between the blocks, the thin lines where one section met another, her fingers tracing those lines with steady pressure, reading them not as separate pieces, but as part of a single structure that had been built to hold together without movement. She started with the east wall, working methodically, her palms sliding across the surface, her fingertips pressing gently into each joint. Searching without urgency, without forcing anything to reveal itself, the mortar felt uniform, dense, aged into something that no longer gave under pressure. There was nothing there. That did not belong. So she continued, because she knew that if something had been placed within this space, it would not be obvious. It would be something you had to feel. She moved along the wall, slowly continuing the same steady motion, her hands sliding across the stone surface, maintaining the same level of pressure. Her attention focused not on what she expected to find, but on any difference, no matter how small, that did not match the rest. When she reached the section near the fireplace, she paused, briefly adjusting her position, and then continued, her hands moving across the mortar lines, just as they had before. The texture remained the same, firm, cold, unyielding, until suddenly her fingertip caught on something. It was subtle, almost nothing, but it was enough to stop her movement immediately. One joint. Only one, located slightly above the fireplace and just off-center. It felt different, not damaged, not loose, not broken, but not the same as the rest. The difference was not visible. It could not be seen by looking, only by touch, only by the way the surface responded under pressure. She pressed again gently, this time focusing only on that point, and felt it clearly, a slight give. So small it could have been dismissed if she had not been paying attention, but she was, and she knew exactly what that meant. She kept her fingertip pressed against that single joint, holding it there, as if confirming what she had already felt. The difference was slight, but undeniable. The mortar did not behave like the rest of the wall. It responded with a softness that should not have been there, not in stone that had settled and hardened over decades. She did not move immediately. Instead, she stayed there for a moment, letting the realization settle into something clear. This was not damage. It was not natural. Where it was something placed. Something changed at a different time by a different hand. The surface had been made to match the rest, but beneath it the structure was not the same. Her mind did not rush ahead. It did not try to guess what was behind it, or why it had been done. She simply recognized the fact that something here did not belong to the original build, and that alone was enough. Slowly, she removed her hand and stepped back. Just enough to take in the full section of the wall again, her eyes tracing the lines, her attention narrowing onto that single point that now stood out even without touch. She had found it. Not by searching for it, but by knowing how to see it. She stepped outside without hesitation and walked back toward the track where she had left her bag, the cold air meeting her face sharply as she moved across the headland, her pace steady, not rushed but certain, as if the next step had already been decided. The moment her fingertip felt that difference in the wall. From her bag she took out a cold chisel and returned to the building, carrying it in one hand. The tool, simple, worn, but enough for what she needed to do. She stepped back inside and moved directly to the wall, positioning herself in front of the section she had found. For a brief moment, she stood still again, not out of doubt but out of clarity. This was no longer observation. This was action. She placed the chisel carefully along the edge of the joint, angling it with precision, and applied steady pressure. The sound that followed was sharp, controlled, echoing lightly against the stone as the first section of mortar gave way. Not breaking apart, but releasing in small, clean pieces. She worked slowly, maintaining the same focus she had used when observing the wall, not forcing anything. Allowing the material to respond as it would, the joint opened gradually, the difference becoming more visible with each careful movement. And then, the stone behind it began to loosen. The granite piece set behind the joint was smaller than the surrounding blocks, fitted precisely into a space that had been shaped for it. It did not fall out or break free suddenly. Instead, it loosened gradually. As she worked along the edges, the remaining mortar releasing with each careful movement, until at last, it shifted just enough for her to grip it. She held it firmly and pulled it free with controlled effort, lifting it away from the wall and setting it down beside her without noise, without haste. Behind it a space opened, a narrow cavity cut directly into the stone, its surface smooth-shaped intentionally by hand, not rough or accidental, but designed to hold something specific, something that had been placed there with purpose, and then sealed away. The air inside the niche felt different, dry, contained, untouched by the movement of the room around it, as if it had been holding its own stillness, separate from everything else. She leaned closer, her attention narrowing completely now, no longer scanning the room, but focused entirely on what had been hidden. Inside the cavity were two objects, and both of them had been waiting for a very long time. She reached into the niche slowly, her movements controlled as if the objects inside required the same care that had preserved them for so many years. The first thing she lifted out was a brass tide gauge, its surface smooth and intact, the metal holding a muted sheen despite the time it had spent. Hidden away, the glass face was unbroken, clear enough to reveal the needle resting quietly in place, as if it had simply paused rather than stopped. She turned it slightly in her hand, examining the details, the weight of it solid, reassuring, the kind of instrument built to last beyond the conditions it was used in. The markings on the back were still legible. The maker's name etched into the metal, along with a date that placed it decades earlier, in a time when the work it belonged to had been active and ongoing. She set it carefully on the granite edge of the fireplace, not treating it as something fragile, but as something important, something that carried meaning beyond its function. Then she reached back into the niche, and this time, her fingers touched something softer, folded, layered, protected, waiting to be opened. She pulled the second object from the niche, slowly revealing a folded sheet wrapped in oilcloth. The material dry, intact, preserved, in a way that suggested it had been sealed carefully, with the intention of protecting what was inside. She held it, for a moment, feeling its weight slight but definite, before moving to the center of the room where the light from the window was strongest. Kneeling down, she placed it on the ground and began to unfold it, layer by layer, her movements precise, careful, not out of fear, but out of respect for something that had remained untouched for so long. The oilcloth opened without resistance, the folds releasing one by one, until the contents inside were exposed. It was a sheet of drafting paper, and on it, drawn in fine, deliberate lines, was a complete tidal chart of the Penobscot Bay system. Every station, every channel, every connection mapped with a level of detail that could only have come from years of direct observation. The ink remained sharp, the lines unbroken, the entire document preserved, as if it had been created only recently rather than decades earlier. She leaned closer, studying it, her eyes moving across the page, taking in the markings, the annotations, the careful handwriting that filled the margins. Each note, placed with intention, each detail contributing to something larger than a simple record. This was not just data. This was understanding captured in form. She remained there on the floor for a long moment, studying the chart, her eyes moving slowly across the surface, following the lines that traced the channels of the bay. Each mark placed with a level of precision that could not have come from guesswork or brief study. This was something built over time, something that reflected years of returning to the same places again and again, until the patterns beneath the surface became clear enough to be drawn. Every station was marked, every tidal movement, noted every variation in flow and depth, carefully recorded not as raw numbers, but as a complete picture of how the system behaved as a whole. It was not simply a collection of measurements. It was a synthesis, a way of showing how everything connected, how the water moved through the bay as a single living structure. Her attention shifted toward the bottom of the page, where a name had been written in the same careful hand, Eleanor Marsh, along with a date range that stretched across nearly 2 decades, followed by a single sentence placed beneath it. The station closes. Today the gauge goes with the truck. The chart stays with the building. The building will remember what the agency will not. She read the sentence once, and then again, and then a third time, letting each word settle into something deeper than understanding. Because this was not just information. This was a decision. She sat there in the quiet of the room with the chart spread out in front of her and let the meaning of that sentence unfold. Slowly, the words were simple, but they carried a weight that extended far beyond the moment in which they had been written. This was not just the end of a project or the closing of a station. It was the recognition that something important was about to be lost, and a deliberate choice had been made to preserve it in a place where it would not disappear. The building will remember what the agency will not. She looked up from the chart and let her eyes move across the stone walls around her, the same walls that had held this hidden space for decades untouched, unnoticed, waiting without any indication of what they contained. The fireplace, the window, the floor, all of it unchanged, and yet now completely different because of what had been revealed. This place had not been empty. It had been holding something. Something left behind with intention by someone who understood that knowledge does not always survive through systems and records, but sometimes survives through care, through placement, through the simple act of leaving something where it belongs. And now, she was standing inside that decision. She remained seated on the floor for a long time, the chart still open in front of her, the quiet of the room settling around her in a way that no longer felt empty but full of presence, as if the space itself carried the weight of everything that had been done there before she arrived. The air was still, the light unchanged, yet her understanding of the room had shifted completely. Outside, the wind moved across the bay, carrying the same cold rhythm it always had, and through the window she could see the old gauge post still standing at the water's edge, fixed in place long after the instrument itself had been removed. It remained as a marker of something that had once been part of a system, now gone, but not entirely lost. She looked back at the chart again, her attention drawn to the careful annotations, the way each note connected to a larger pattern, the way the entire system had been understood, not through isolated measurements but through continuous observation over time. This was what had been left behind, not just a record, but a way of seeing something that could not be replaced once it was gone. And in that moment, she understood that finding it was not an accident. It was the continuation of something that had already begun long before she stepped into the room. She gathered the chart, carefully folding the oilcloth back around it with the same attention it had been sealed with, and placed it beside the brass gauge. On the granite ledge for a moment, she simply stood there looking at both objects together, understanding that what she had uncovered was not just something old, but something unfinished, something that had been left in a state of waiting rather than closure. The light from the window shifted slightly as the afternoon moved forward, casting a softer tone across the room, and she turned toward the doorway, stepping outside once again into the cold air of the headland the wind moved across, the open space carrying with it the familiar scent of salt and distance. She looked out across the bay, the same water she had watched since childhood, the same movement, the same patterns unchanged by time in the way that mattered most. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, she felt something settle into place, not as a solution, not as a recovery, but as a direction. There was something here that needed to be understood, and now she knew where to begin. That same afternoon, she drove back into town, the chart wrapped carefully beside her on the passenger seat, the brass gauge secured so it would not move. As the car followed the narrow coastal road toward Castine, the sky had already begun to dim slightly as the day moved toward evening, but her focus remained steady, fixed on what she had just found and what it might mean beyond the moment itself. She did not return to the building that day. Instead, she went directly to the Castine Public Library, a place that had remained unchanged in its quiet purpose for years. The kind of place where information did not disappear, but waited to be found by those who knew how to look for it. Inside, the air was warm and still, carrying the soft presence of paper and wood and time. She approached the reference desk where a woman named Marlene stood sorting through a stack of returned materials. Her expression calm. Her movements practiced the kind that come from years of doing the same work with care. Nadia placed the folded chart gently on the desk and explained only what was necessary, not adding more than the moment required. Marlene listened, and then without hesitation began to search. Marlene moved with quiet efficiency through the library, guiding Nadia toward the reference section where older records were kept, not all in plain sight, but organized in a way that required familiarity to navigate. She did not rush. She did not ask unnecessary questions. She simply followed the process she had repeated for years, knowing where to begin and how to move from one source to another until something relevant emerged. Within minutes, she had located entries connected to the name written on the chart. Eleanor Marsh. The records were not extensive, but they were enough to establish a clear outline. A coastal hydrologist who had worked with the Gulf of Maine Tidal Survey Project for nearly 2 decades, beginning in the early 1950s, and continuing until the project was eventually discontinued. Marlene continued searching. She cross-referenced catalogs and archived listings, moving between systems with ease, her experience allowing her to trace connections that would not have been obvious to someone unfamiliar with the structure of the records. She located additional references confirming that Eleanor Marsh had been responsible for field data collection across the Penobscot Bay system, documenting tidal behavior at multiple stations over the course of her work. Each piece of information added weight to what Nadia had already begun to understand. This was not a fragment. This was a missing part of something much larger. Marlene continued her search, moving deeper into the archived records, connecting one reference to another, until a clearer picture began to form. Eleanor Marsh had spent 17 years working in the field across the Penobscot Bay system, visiting the same stations, repeatedly collecting measurements, observing patterns, and building a record of tidal behavior that extended across nearly 2 decades. Her work had been consistent, methodical, and largely undocumented in public records beyond basic listings and archived summaries. When the survey project was discontinued, her records had been transferred to a federal archive managed by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in Maryland. But there was a note attached to them, listing something that stood out among the otherwise structured documentation. Her field notebooks, which would have contained the full set of observations, were marked as missing, several years after the transfer had been completed. Marlene paused at that detail, looking up briefly at Nadia before returning to the files, confirming the note through a secondary source. An inventory record from the late 1980s that repeated the same conclusion: the notebooks had not been located and were considered lost. Nadia listened without interrupting because she already understood something that the records did not show. They had never been lost. They had been left. She left the library that evening with more than just information. She left with direction. The chart remained beside her, carefully wrapped. But now it carried context. It was no longer an isolated discovery. It was part of a larger story, one that had been interrupted and left incomplete decades earlier. She returned to the car and sat for a moment before starting the engine, looking out toward the bay where the light had already begun to fade, the water moving in the same steady rhythm it always had, unchanged by the passage of time, or the absence of those who had once studied it. What had been missing was not the water, it was the record. And now that record had begun to return, not in full, not yet, but enough to reveal what had been left behind, and why it mattered. She understood that the chart was only the beginning, a summary, a final piece created at the end of a long period of observation, but behind it there had been years of detailed work, measurements, notes, daily entries, the kind of material that does not simply disappear without leaving a trace somewhere. Those records existed, and now she knew they could be found. That night she wrote to the archive in Maryland using her phone while sitting in the car outside the library. The message was clear, direct, and focused on the information she had uncovered. She described the chart, the location where it had been found, and the connection to Eleanor Marsh's work across the Penobscot Bay system. She did not include unnecessary detail. She simply provided what was needed to establish that something important had been recovered. She sent the message and waited without expectation, knowing that responses to archival inquiries could take time, and that even with clear information there was no guarantee of immediate recognition or action. Days passed, and then, weeks during that time, she returned to the building on the headland, spending hours inside studying the chart more closely, comparing its markings to what she already knew about the bay, tracing the lines with her finger as if reading them the same way she had once watched her mother read the water. When the reply finally came, it was direct and immediate in its tone, confirming that Eleanor Marsh's work represented a significant gap in the historical title record of the region, and that any material connected to it could be of considerable value. The response did not feel like validation. It felt like confirmation of something she had already understood. The archivist who responded to her message followed up the next morning with a call, his voice direct, focused, and carrying the kind of attention that comes when something unexpected appears in a place where it was not supposed to be. He asked questions about the chart, about the condition it was found in, about the exact location, within the building, and how it had been preserved for so long. Nadia answered each question, clearly describing the niche, the sealed mortar, the oilcloth wrapping, and the condition of the paper, explaining that the chart had not been exposed to air or moisture for decades, which was why it had remained intact. He listened carefully, not interrupting, only asking for clarification when necessary. He explained that the absence of Eleanor Marsh's records had been a known gap in the archive for years, something referenced but never resolved. The baseline data from that period before large-scale coastal development and long-term environmental shifts was considered critical for understanding how the bay had changed over time. Without it, any comparison between past and present remained incomplete. What Nadia had found was not just historical, it was essential. And for the first time since she had opened the wall, she understood the full scale of what had been left behind. In the days that followed, her understanding of the discovery deepened. She returned again and again to the chart, studying it not just as a document, but as a system of thought, something built carefully over years by someone who had stood in the same places. She had stood and had seen the same movements in the water, and had taken the time to understand them fully. The annotations were not random notes. They were precise observations tied to specific conditions, moments where something had been recognized and recorded because it revealed a pattern that repeated over time, each mark on the page connected to another, creating a structure that could only be understood by stepping back and seeing how all the parts fit together. She began to trace those patterns against the current state of the bay, comparing what had been observed decades earlier with what she could now see for herself, noticing where the changes had occurred, where the flow had shifted, where the balance between fresh water and tidal movement had altered in ways that were subtle but significant. The more she looked, the clearer it became that this was not something that could remain. As it was, it needed to be rebuilt. Not physically, but in understanding. She began the process, slowly setting up a workspace inside the building on the headland, using what she had available, a simple table placed near the window, where the light was strongest, the chart positioned carefully where it could be seen without being handled unnecessarily, and her notebooks arranged beside it, ready to receive what would be reconstructed from the work that had come before. Day by day, she worked through the details, transferring the annotations from the chart into her own records, translating the information into a form that could be compared against existing data. She cross-referenced the market stations with historical tide tables, filling in what could be confirmed and identifying where interpretation was required. It was careful work requiring both patience and precision, because the chart itself was not a full dataset. It was a summary, a final representation of something larger that had once existed in full detail and now had to be rebuilt from what remained. But she was not starting from nothing. She had the patterns, she had the structure. And most importantly, she understood how to read what was in front of her. The work required time, and she gave it fully, returning to the building each day, regardless of weather or condition. The cold of winter settling into the stone walls while she worked beside the small heat source she had set up near the window, the light shifting earlier each afternoon as the days shortened, but never interrupting the rhythm she had established. She moved between the chart and her notebooks, steadily reconstructing the information piece by piece, using the knowledge she had built over years to interpret what could not be directly measured. She compared past patterns to present observations, testing each conclusion against what she could verify in the field, returning to the water, when needed, to confirm what the data suggested. It was not fast work, and it was not meant to be. It required the same level of attention that had gone into creating the chart in the first place, a willingness to stay with the process without rushing toward an outcome. And over time, what had once been a single sheet of summarized observation began to expand again, taking form as something complete, something that could once again be understood as a full system rather than a fragment. As the winter deepened, the building became more than just a place of work. It became a space where everything she had been carrying began to settle into clarity. The routine of returning each day, of continuing the reconstruction without interruption, created a rhythm that replaced the uncertainty she had been living with since losing the fellowship. She set up a simple sleeping arrangement inside the station, placing a cot near the fireplace and using a small stove to keep the space warm enough to continue working through the colder nights. The chart remained fixed on the wall where it could be seen at all times, not as something distant, but as something she was actively engaged with. The isolation did not feel empty. It felt focused, removed from distraction, allowing her to give full attention to what was in front of her. Each day she woke to the same view, the same water, the same patterns moving through, the bay unchanged by her presence but fully available to be read. And within that consistency, she found something she had not felt in a long time. Not stability in the way she had known it before, but direction. As the weeks passed, her work began to extend beyond the limits of the chart, itself moving from reconstruction into verification. She carried her notes back out to the water, returning to the same stations where measurements had once been taken. Standing at the edge of the bay in the cold air, watching the movement of the tide, and comparing what she saw with what had been recorded decades earlier. She did not rely only on numbers, she trusted what she observed directly, allowing the patterns in the water to confirm or challenge what she had written. She began to recognize where the system had changed, where the flow had shifted slightly, where the timing of the tide no longer matched the older observations. Exactly. These differences were not dramatic, they were subtle, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, but they were consistent enough to matter, and through them she could see the passage of time not as something abstract but as something measurable, something that had altered the behavior of the bay in ways that could now be understood. Back inside the building, she refined her notes, adjusting her reconstruction carefully, making small corrections where necessary, always cross-checking each conclusion against both the historical data and her present observations. The process required patience and a willingness to question her own assumptions. But with each revision, the system became clearer. The relationships between the channels, the currents, and the freshwater inputs forming a structure that could be followed and understood. And as that structure came into focus, she realized that what she was rebuilding was not only a record of the past, but a foundation for understanding the present, something that connected what had been observed decades ago with what could now be seen, directly allowing the bay to be read across time as a continuous system rather than a series of disconnected measurements. As the work continued, her understanding moved beyond reconstruction into something more complete, something that connected observation data and lived experience into a single way of seeing. She returned again and again to the edge of the bay, standing in the cold wind, watching the tide move through the same channels that had been mapped decades earlier, allowing the patterns to reveal themselves without forcing meaning onto them. She compared what she saw with what had been recorded, tracing the lines of the chart in her mind while the water moved in front of her, recognizing where the system remained unchanged and where it had shifted over time. The changes were not dramatic. They did not announce themselves clearly, but they were present in the timing of the currents, in the subtle differences in surface texture, in the way the water responded to wind and depth and shoreline, each variation small on its own, but together forming a pattern that showed how the bay had evolved gradually across years that had not been fully recorded anywhere else. She carried those observations back into the building, refining her notes, adjusting her reconstructions, working through each section of the system carefully. Never assuming accuracy without confirmation, she cross-referenced historical tide tables, compared seasonal variations, and tested each conclusion against what she could directly observe, maintaining the same discipline that had guided both her own work and the work that had come before her. The process was slow and required a level of attention that left no room for distraction. But within that slowness, something steady began to form, a structure that held together not just as information, but as understanding, something that could be followed from one point to another without breaking apart into uncertainty. She realized that what she was building was not simply a recovery of lost data. It was a continuation of a method, a way of reading the water that extended beyond instruments and records and into direct perception, something that could not be replaced once lost, but could be carried forward if it was understood deeply enough. And as that realization settled into place, she no longer saw the chart as something finished or complete. She saw it as a beginning, something left behind, not to be preserved as it was, but to be continued through the same attention, the same patience, and the same willingness to see what others might overlook, allowing the system to exist again not only on paper, but in practice, in real time, in the movement of the water itself. As the final weeks of winter gave way to early spring, the work she had been building reached a point where it no longer felt unfinished. The patterns that had once existed, only as fragments, had been reconstructed into something whole, something that could now be followed, understood, and applied. Beyond the walls of the building she had entered months earlier, she stood again at the edge of the headland, looking out across the bay, the water moving with the same quiet rhythm it always had, unchanged in its nature, but now fully readable in a way that connected past and present into a single continuous system. She no longer needed to rely on what had been left behind, because she had already carried it forward, translating it into her own understanding through observation, patience, and repetition. The chart that had once been hidden was no longer the center of what she was doing. It had become a reference, a starting point for something that now existed independently within her work, within her notes, and within the way she saw the water itself. The records she had rebuilt began to take form as something that could be shared not as a static document, but as a living system of observation, one that could be used to understand changes in the bay over time, to measure what had shifted, and to preserve what still remained consistent in a world that was gradually moving away from that kind of attention. She returned to the library once more, bringing with her not just the original chart, but the expanded work she had created, placing it on the same desk where the search had begun. And this time, when Marlene looked at it, there was no need for explanation. The meaning was already clear. This was not something that had simply been found. It was something that had been restored, continued, and brought back into relevance. The archive that had once held only a gap would now hold something complete. Something that filled in what had been missing for decades. But even as the work moved beyond the building and into a wider context, she continued to return to the headland not out of obligation, but because it remained the place where everything made sense, where observation was still the beginning of understanding, where the water could be read directly without interference, and where the method she had inherited and rebuilt could continue to exist in its original form. She stood there one morning, as the light moved across the bay, the same way it always had, the same shifting tones, the same quiet movement, and for a moment everything aligned not as a resolution or an ending, but as a continuation, something that did not need to be finished. Because it was still unfolding in real time, she understood then that what had been left behind had not been meant to remain hidden. It had been meant to be found by someone who would recognize it for what it was, not just a record, not just a piece of history, but a way of seeing that could only survive if it was carried forward, and now it had been. And as she turned from the water and began to walk back toward the building, she did so without hesitation, without uncertainty. Because there was nothing left to search for. She was no longer following something that had been lost. She was continuing something that had never ended.